Okay, all right, so welcome everyone to our webinar titled ISO 14971 Medical Risk Management Best Practices. My name is Ben Harampali and I'm a pre-sales colleague here at Intland, and I'm going to be your host for today. First off, let's see the agenda. I'm going to be starting off by talking about risk management in medical device development. Then I'm going to get a little more specific and talk about requirements of medical standards and regulations, then the ISO 14971 medical devices and the application of risk management to medical devices, which will be followed by our live demonstration of Codebeamer, as always. Just a little bit of information about a webinar. The demo will be followed by a questions and answers session, as always, so you'll get to ask your questions. You will receive a recording of the webinar, and it will also be available on our website. And if you do visit our website, please register to any of our upcoming webinars or events that you find interesting. We're not going to have a webinar next week or the week after that. So our next webinar is going to be 3 weeks from now, titled Evaluating and Selecting an ALM Solution. Okay, quick info about us. We were founded in 1998 and our headquarters is here in Stuttgart, Germany. We're the sole vendors and developers of Codebeamer ALM, and we have an office in Silicon Valley, California, resellers in UK, China, Korea, Taiwan, France, and Italy, and our partners are Lufthansa Industry Solutions. This slide is just to show you that we have all kinds of customers, especially those in the highly regulated industries like the medical, automotive, aviation, and defense, but we also have a few others in the high-tech, embedded, and finance. And you can really see how scalable the solution is. Okay, so let's get started. The task of making a medical device safe for human use has actually become more and more difficult due to, first of all, the globalization of the medical device marketplace, and that combined with the growth of medical device usage and, of course, the increased reliance on software in all types of industries, not just the medical industry. So as clinicians, patients, litigators, and regulators become more and more sensitive, and rightly so, of course, to safety issues related to human factors, risk management is necessary to ensure device usability, safety, and regulatory compliance. By definition, risk management involves the identification, the understanding, the control, and prevention of failures that may result in hazards during the use of medical devices. Besides it being, of course, required by law, performing risk management can lead to the identification of device design problems prior to manufacturing and distribution, which eliminates costs associated with recalls. And needless to say, it can also obviously offer a measure of protection from damages from product liability claims. Also, regulatory submissions checklists used by the FDA, for example, call for inclusion of risk analysis. Okay, so an overall risk management process looks like this, what you can see here on the left-hand side on this diagram. So in order to manage your risks and hazards need to be identified first. Then by evaluating the potential consequences and likelihood of hazards, a measure of risk can then be estimated. This value is compared to the company's risk acceptability criteria or matrix, which I'll show you what those look like in demonstration. And if it is deemed to be too high, the risk needs to be mitigated. Okay, so but how should you approach this process? The most important aspect of risk management is anticipating the possible failures of the system. You have to define control measures, whether they are inherently safe, preventive, corrective, or informative. And each failure should lead to risk control measures, or RCMs, and each RCM should lead to requirements implemented in the product hardware, software, or the documentation. Now, here on the right-hand side, you can see the different types of risk control measures. You can see that ranging from top to bottom, from most effective, which actually results in a safe place, to least effective, which results in a safe person. Elimination is actually the process of physically removing the hazard, and that's the most effective, but of course it's not always possible. The second type is substitution, and that's replacing the hazard with something that has a low risk impact. Then engineering controls is the process of isolating the people from the hazard, while administrative controls change the way the people work. Then the last one down at the bottom, PPE, or personal protective equipment, is protecting the person with protective gear and is regarded to be the least effective. This is just pretty high level stuff. Moving on in software specifically, the risk management process goes as follows. First, you have to identify the software items that could contribute to a hazardous situation. Then you need to identify causes of contribution to a hazardous situation, followed by defining the risk control measures, verifying those risk control measures, and then finally documenting the traceability. So let's talk a bit about documentation. The risk management file, for example. You need to establish a risk management file for each of your medical devices. These risk management files should include all of the records and documents that your risk management process generates. They should contain risk management plans and are used to record risk analyses, risk evaluations, risk control measures, and residual risk evaluations. Use your risk management files to facilitate traceability of your software hazards, from the hazardous situation to the software item, from the software item to the specific software cause, from the software cause to the risk control measure, and from the risk control measure to the verification of that risk control measure. Now, again, for software, there are 3 safety classes based on the severity of your risk. Class A is when there's no injury or damage to health possible. Class B is non-serious injury is possible, and Class C is when there death or serious injury is possible. Safety means freedom from unacceptable risk, and risk acceptability criteria are used to help decide whether or not a risk is unacceptable. Here, I'd like to briefly mention that safety is not to be confused with security. That's completely different. Just to add that, because security is the protection of information and data so that unauthorized people or systems cannot read or modify them, but also that authorized people or systems are not denied access to them. So that's security, different from safety. Okay, as a basic foundation, it is assumed by the ISO 14971 that all medical devices are developed and maintained within a quality management and a risk management system. Since the risk management process is detailed and very well defined in the ISO 14971, the IEC 62304, which you might be familiar with, is the international standard for medical device or software, makes use of this advantage with a simple normative reference to ISO 14971. So that's why we're talking about the ISO 14971. Of course, some minor additional risk management requirements are needed for software, especially in the area of identification of contributing software factors related to hazards, but these requirements are summarized in Clause 7 of the ISO 14971 as the software risk management process. Now, Clause 7 I've summarized here. This summary includes the following steps for the risk management process. First, identifying hazards and hazardous conditions associated with a medical device that could place patients or healthcare workers at risk. Then, estimating the potential occurrence of such risks and evaluating the extent of the consequences. Then, developing and implementing active safeguards within the device or the production process to control risks, and regularly viewing and monitoring the process to assess the effectiveness of risk management controls and the risk management process. And I have this simplified here. You can see the steps here and in this chart as well. Now, risk management, according to the aforementioned ISO 14971, is defined in 2 parts: the probability of occurrence of harm and the consequences of that harm, or how severe it might be, in other words. In this case, a medical device company has to consider this definition and then expand on a given product's risk by using tools such as the risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, and production and post-production information throughout the initial development to product realization and eventual delivery of your product. During the risk analysis, you have to consider how the product is intended to be used, what possible hazards evolve from those uses, and then place an estimation on the degree to which risk is possible. Following this analysis, you then should conduct its risk evaluation. During the risk evaluation, you should be deciding which hazards will require actions through risk reductions using defined risk guidelines. After hazards that require risk reduction are defined, you have to move on to risk control or putting measures in place to reduce the risk to an overall acceptable level. Lastly, after these steps have been taken, you need to complete the entire risk assessment cycle by considering whether production and post-production information requires adjustment to reflect any previously unrecognized risks or previously unacceptable risks. In either case, when these judgments are made, the process should start over. And as risk is inherent, the goal of this process is actually to closely manage risk and not necessarily eliminate them altogether. But risk management applies to all medical device companies, and in the end, it protects both the manufacturing companies and consumers. Companies are provided with a proven tool for driving the inherent risk of their products down, while consumers can be reassured that any hazards to them with the medical devices they may come into contact with are being managed through a systematic approach to making the product safer for use. This is actually a central theme of ISO 13485, which is the standard for quality management systems for medical devices and one of the driving motivations for its continued growth within the standards community. Okay, now before I jump into the live demonstration of our tool, there's one more thing I'd like to clarify, which is difference between risks and failure modes. So risks are uncertainties that matter and are driven by the IEC 62304, the software lifecycle processes. In our system in Codebeamer, we have likelihood and severity calculating the impact of the risk. Likelihood multiplied by severity. From these risks, the system can draw risk matrix diagrams with links to the requirements and the related risks, and following your own predetermined mitigation actions, you can mitigate these risks. So how it works is risks are derived from requirements, and further requirements can be derived from those risks to mitigate them. Now, failure modes, on the other hand, are based on the ISO 14971, the failure mode and effects analysis, and are defined as potential ways your product can fail. And they're calculated with a risk priority number, which consists of a severity, an occurrence or likelihood, and a detection number. So severity times occurrence times detection. They're both implemented in Codebeamer's medical template just to show that the system can be configured to support and manage both types. Okay, a short list of our resources here. And let's jump into the demonstration and see how a risk management process looks like in Codebeamer. So here I'm in Codebeamer right now. I'm in my our medical template. This is what it looks like. Each project, this template as well, has a wiki page, a home page, where you can actually manage, it's kind of like a knowledge base. So everybody working on this project can stay up to date. It's like a single source of truth. And you can manage processes and things like that here. We actually have the software risk management process defined here. And you can add links to documents and things like that, and that's what it's really good for. Now, if I go into trackers, jump right in, I can see this is how our medical template is set up. So we have custom requirements going into system requirements, drilling down to software requirements, and as you can see, like I mentioned earlier, we have risks and failure modes set up as well. So I'm going to jump into software requirements first. And on the left-hand side, I can see the hierarchy of what my requirements, how my requirements are built up. And in the middle, I can see the document itself in the document view. And on the right-hand side, I can see the details or properties of each specific requirement. Now from the tree, I can just select one of my requirements. And by clicking on this plus sign and clicking on generate risk, I can actually create a risk or a failure mode from this screen. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to create a risk. And I can assign all types of information here. So I'm going to add, what was this requirement? I'm going to name it something. I can add a situation, what the risk situation is. And then I can actually add likelihood. Let's make it flow 4, then a severity 6. And the risk is calculated by multiplying likelihood and severity. That's the risk number. And then I can add a planned risk mitigation. So this is where I type all the tests or all the steps that I have to add, or all the steps that I have to go through to mitigate this risks. And then if I already know this in advance, I can add my planned risk mitigation and my likelihood after mitigation, for example, and severity. So those will be mitigated to 1 and 2. And then that will be calculated as well. And I can actually assign a mitigation requirement here as well. So that is how I would mitigate a requirement. So I'm going to save this. Now on the right hand side down here, I can see my references. And I can see I just created this risk for here, for this one. And if I go into here, into the risk itself, I can see the likelihood and severity is calculated before and after mitigation. And now what I'm going to want to do is create a mitigation requirement for this. So I'm going to say I already have a software requirement predefined here. And I'm just going to add this requirement to be the mitigation requirement for this one. Then I set it and I can save it. Okay, and now if I want to see these relationships, how my risks are mitigated and everything, I can use my traceability browser to go through there. So if I'm gonna start out by going into the software requirements and clicking on my traceability browser. And that way it's going to add columns and I can view the relationships really well between my software and risks. But I could have started out I'm going to start out with customer requirements, then drill into system requirements. So I can see it's already adding the columns here. Then drill further down into software requirements, and then add all the risks that are related to those software requirements. So I can see, for example, operating conditions, a customer requirement has this functional electrical simulation system requirement, the related software requirement, and all the risks that are attached or related to this software requirement. Now, if I want to be more specific and drill it down or specify it a little bit more, I'm just going to start out from my software requirements. And then add my risks. And I can see all the software requirements with all the related risks. And I can play around with this. I can actually go into risks and see all the risks that have mitigation requirements added. So I can see, or don't, so whatever is more relevant. I started out with risks, and then I'm going to add all my software requirements. So I'm going to assume that those are the ones. And if I want to see only the ones that are mitigated, the risks that are mitigated with related requirements, I have to uncheck these associations and only view either the outgoing relations. So that's one way to do it. And then I can see that all the ones that have all the risks that have a software requirement are the ones that are mitigated. So that's how it's set up. They have related mitigation requirements. But if I only want to see those specific risks, then I've pre-defined a view which shows me all risks with mitigation requirements. So if I click on here, I can filter this down, and now I can only see those risks that have mitigation requirements added. Okay, and I can do this the other way around. I can choose the one all risk without mitigation requirements. And of course, there's no third column because there are no mitigation requirements. So these are the risks that have no mitigation requirements added. But they can still be mitigated, defined by the process of how you do this. Now, the next feature I wanted to show you was the risk matrix diagram for software requirements, for example. But this can be set up for each requirement. So what I see here is 3 risk matrix diagrams: the initial risk matrix, the risk matrix after mitigation, and the combined risk matrix. And it shows me the number of the risks and the number of related requirements or user stories in each cell regarding the severity and likelihood values. So if I click on one of these numbers, I can see the risk, and I can drill down into the risk itself by clicking on this link, and I can see the related requirement or user story here as well, related to that risk. So there's 2 actually, there's this one and this one. And then all of these are clickable, so I can see all of the related risks and requirements. And then I've got my risk matrix after mitigation and the combined risk matrix diagram. Okay, now another thing we have set up for this template is actually a workflow for the software requirements. So let's say I have, the way we have it set up, but this is highly configurable, so there's a lot you can do with this. Let's say I have a software requirement, for example, this one, or I can just easily add a new one. I'm just going to add a new one. Requirements can be imported as well, so however you'd like to work with requirements. I just created a new requirement. I'm going to pull it up into this tree here. And the way we have the workflow set up is if I set the safety to high of this specific requirement. Oh yeah, okay, so I have to refresh this quickly because I moved it in the tree. And I set the safety to high. And if I accept this requirement, so I want to set the status first to define. That's how the workflow is defined. I have to define it first, and then I accept it. Let me show you this. I've got no relations here yet. But if I set it to accept and the safety was set to high, then I actually automatically create a test, first of all, a test case, and a risk. So the system automatically generates a risk for this requirement if the safety is set to high. And then I can follow the process by mitigating the risk and then so on and so forth, what I showed you earlier. And I want to show you what this looks like. It's pretty neat. You can define your workflow here, and this is the workflow for the software requirements, the process. And if I expand the distance here, I can see all the sub-processes that it generates. So on the state transition diagram here, you can see that setting the software requirement status from draft to accepted will actually trigger these 2 sub-processes. First of all, the risk and generating the test case. And they will automatically be related to that requirement. So that's all I wanted to show you today. As you can see, risk management is something that you actually have to actively do. So it's not something that's just a byproduct of general good intentions or good engineering. You really have to actively act on it. All right, so that was it. Thanks for your attention. And does anyone have any questions? If not, then I'd like to ask you a quick question. Please vote on the poll that I sent you. All right, great, thanks. So if nobody has any questions, remember we don't have a webinar next week or the week after that. We have one in 3 weeks, evaluating and selecting an ALM solution. Make sure you join us. And thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.